Good morning. Thank you, Professor Schroeder, and thank you to the faculty for inviting me back again. It's a pleasure. And as David said, I have understood very little of what's been going on, but I've been enjoying the photographs. I've been enjoying the drawings. So, yes, this is a kind of this is a moment out of context, let's say, but hopefully not completely out of context. So I'm going to talk about a couple of apartment buildings, quite in a way prosaic in terms of a commission, commissioned by a council, 80% of them social housing, so a modest project. But if I may, I'm going to start with the idea of the dignity of form. So designed together, and perhaps more than any other of our projects, they have been led by their form, by what one might call iterations of intuition, testing type and program. In this instance, the limits and geometry of site, the character of the surrounding buildings, and the landscape prompted us to picture these buildings a priori as types, villas and a palazzo. The works explore how buildings constitute a city, their relationship to the public realm, and in this case, what I call an accidental parkland, by what we wish to be understood when we speak of home. I'd like to suggest that they illustrate well the generative potential of form in reconciling the two opposing design methodologies to which Colin Rowe refers in his article, Program versus Paradigm, otherwise Casual Notes on the Pragmatic, the Typical and the Possible, which he wrote in 1980. The first being the program, the other being the type, or as he refers to it, the paradigm. Home is not a functional description of use, followed by subcategories of prescriptive rooms, but an all-encompassing idea about the impression one gets, its characteristics and its qualities. These buildings are located on the edge of a 1950s London County Council designed housing estate in East London. The estate with its blocks of deck access flats replaced a neighbourhood of bomb-damaged streets and terraced houses. Our work, commissioned by local government, Taylor Chatto in the bottom left and Wilmott Court top right, were to maximise capacity to meet the insatiable demand for homes. The scheme stitches these buildings into the edge of the wider estate. Taylor and Chatto accommodate 20 dwellings in 3 5-storey villas, 2 of which share a core and are connected by bridges. The tripartite plan creates apertures between the 3 bodies, preserving views and establishing a route from street to estate, reducing the impact on the microclimate of the newly created courtyard to the north of the new apartment buildings, but also formalising the completion of the courtyard with a single structure. Inside, the section sandwiches apartments on the middle floors between 2-storey houses with front doors to the street and maisonettes above. By contrast, the other building, Wilmott Court's Palazzo, creates a new urban block and 25 homes. The first 3 floors accommodate 17 apartments that are planned around a central hall and staircase, which is daylit by an open court above, around which there are 8 houses. Facades and loggias bring a logic to the construction, tempering the internal environment, playing a role as social space through their inhabitation, heightening residents' awareness of their environment, and providing a buffer between the private domain of home and the public city. Facades are monolithic. The walls of Taylor and Chatto are hand-laid wild bond brickwork bearing on precast plinths, which relate to the scale of the human body and form a weathering ground to the buildings. At Wilmott Court, the same brickwork bears on precast loggias and string courses, firmly broken from the warm frame inside. In negotiating between the modernist estate and the Victorian street, the work realises the English town planner Patrick Abercrombie's 1943 London Plan ambition to provide for a greater mingling of the different groups of London society. The subjectivity of form. I think it's fair to say that compared to the plan, the form is a more subjective proposition. However, unless you're delving into a publication and poring over plans, it is form in an encounter that we experience first. It is form that we sense, that we see, and a proxy for other dimensions of the work. It is what we first seek to understand. But before there is a design or a building, it is conventionally described by a program of activity spaces, and in the case of housing, be prescribed dwelling types, their tenure and size, all of which is verbal, numerical, and abstract. Planning a building, one associates rooms within a dwelling that reflect relationships and activities within a household, and we associate dwellings with one another to invite neighbourliness, common and communal experience. But the realization the plan is only an amalgam of small private rooms in various localized configurations within any number of dwellings. Form, therefore, plays a crucial part in shaping this abstracted set of needs, translating it into something recognizable. It was seen that form makes sense, and so in this respect, form is fundamental in the conception of an architecture. The site plan shows the three villas that constitute Taylor and Chatto, the loggias orientated west, north and east, and the apertures between the buildings admitting sunlight from the south and views from the street to the courtyard and vice versa. The left-hand aperture to the west establishes a path between street and estate and an entrance court shaped and proportioned by folds in the building form and the walls that line the space, sufficient for rooms and balconies to be orientated into it. The villa form reflects the Victorian street scene, but with the loggia orientated west, north or east, it also seeks to make sense of this accidental parkland of the estate. I hope this is not uneasy on the eye. These three bodies shape space and remake the landscape. Orientating these bodies to the landscape wakes the accidental parkland from its torpor. By comparison, the palazzo form takes a mould of the street. Its form reveals the curvature of an ancient thoroughfare, once a rural lane between villages, in a contemporary urban landscape, and in so doing reveals a benign geometry, giving it tangible form. From a practical perspective, this would also maximize the building's footprint, give it an extensive perimeter behind which to distribute rooms and windows, and a generous central hall, and an efficient form factor. Forms of construction. The structure and construction yield two types of form and two kinds of space. Framed forms establish the limits of threshold spaces outside, and monolithic solids encapsulate interiors. Each forms a dimension of shelter associated with activity. This approach to construction establishes a duality of experience, but also, like Neve Brown's Alexander Road housing, displaces the vertical facade with the horizontal terrace. Home is expressed by the space captured by the loggia, and its inhabitation by residents, their plants, and their other visible possessions. The representational aspect of the facade is replaced by experience. The horizontal plane thus plays an important part in the elevation of the building. It is a facade laid down, inhabited space, serving as the face of the building. The framework of the loggia serves as a setting that reveals aspects of the inhabitant's personality. It is the very antithesis of a facade as mask. As Neve Brown suggested, the facade should establish a literal before a symbolic role. Attunement, orientation and engagement. When the estate was designed, the Victorian street pattern was replaced by an open landscape in which freestanding apartment blocks were deployed with habitable rooms orientated south and west. Their functionalism chose not to acknowledge history, or the idea of the city as a contiguous form. In response, our new buildings are two-faced, one to the street and the other to the estate. The two types of form and two kinds of space, to which I referred earlier, mediate between the scale and the character of the surrounding 19th century terraces and the 20th century estate. The loggias and terraces orientate inhabitants to face the estate's accidental parkland. The frame attunes the inhabitant to the unlikely pastoral landscape. These two types of constructed form and two types of space offer a parity between a life lived indoors and one lived outside. By comparison, the palazzo's relationship to the city is held in equilibrium by the loggias and terraces, the frame mediating between the intimate home and the crowded city. Not manufacturing dwellings. Ultimately, these forms intentionally resist any reading of mass production and therefore of repetition as a social ideal of public housing. And some of the building's most joyful characteristics stem from rational decisions. Perhaps the most unlikely are the bridges. These became a possibility because with just two dwellings above ground, we couldn't justify a dedicated core within the smallest villa. Instead, it shares the core within the central villa. One bridge is expressed as one half of a brick arch, itself an extension to the form of the smallest villa. The other, a comparatively fine steel structure, its linearity giving it autonomy. Returning to the wider context, there are perhaps similarities to the Smithsons' work at the University of Bath. There they described a number of their buildings, most notably the School of Architecture and Building Engineering, as woven onto the edge of an existing mat building, a series of tassels that are going to be needed to make the mat's terminating fringe, so it can lie there on its gently sloping green hillside, seemingly complete. But where the Smithsons sought to tie knots with their buildings at the edge of the university campus to take the open system of the mat typology and conjure up the image of a rug, we found ourselves repairing a seam in the urban fabric between the 20th century estate and the traditional city. Program, typology and form. As an architect, I generally found it easier to speak about the plan and its relation to space, and ideas about association. I hear myself advocate for concavity and concentricity, that a building has a notional centre and periphery, albeit not a literal geometry. Words that conjure up a building's capacity to envelop a human body and for it to engender congregation and association. I remain cautious about justifying purely formal decisions. However, these apartment buildings and this description explore the role of form in determining our architecture. And whilst no two projects are the same, this might shed some light on what really happens in our studio in the making of form and the part it plays in terms of cause and effect in the relation to plan and space. Whilst there is an organisational logic in the way that the lateral apartments and duplexes are distributed in the sections and rhythms running through the elevations, both buildings parties reject the functionalist repetitive version of housing, be that an allusion to existence minimum, idealisation or pure economics, for instead a number of situated dwellings, each mediating between eras of city fabric, between thoroughfare and open estate, respond to immediate proximities and geometries. They obscure any literalness in the way buildings might reflect programs, codes and regulations. So for Chatto and Taylor to be understood as urban villas, much like those built in the 19th century on the other side of the street, they must adopt their language of monolithic masonry and facades with a vertical emphasis, without ubiquitous external balconies or terraces stipulating the brief for a contemporary urban apartment. But then these are constructed to face the estate, where they adopt something of the language of the mid-20th century. So to return to Colin Rowe, type becomes a hypothesis, something to be tested against the empirical requirements of the programme, but also the geometry, microclimate, landscape character, and history of a site. In so doing, iterating to an unfamiliar but more accurate position than the initial type form would accommodate. Ultimately, it is with form that we speak to be understood. Thank you.